So in this final video, we're going to talk about the Mill extract that you read for this week. The very first thing I want to do, though, is start by talking about terminology, because Mill introduces lots of examples of different kinds of words that we're going to be thinking about a lot and coming back to. But he uses a very different kind of terminology than we do, and he also maybe doesn't. There are other ways to distinguish between them than the ones he uses that I want to introduce to you guys. So because I'm going to now introduce you to the names that we're going to use throughout. I'm going to give you a way of translating from Mill's way of talking into the way that we're going to talk from now on. So Mill uses the word name in a very general way. He calls lots of different he thinks there are lots of different kinds of names. So let's just start off by looking at a list of the different kinds of things that he calls names. So we've been talking about the name David Boylan. That is indeed something that Mill would call a name. But you'll see he calls other things names too. For instance, the word human. That's another example of a name for Mill. Or the word gold. The word gold. That's another example of a name. And then finally, although obviously he doesn't use this example, expressions like the author of Harry Potter. That's another kind of expression that he calls a name. Now, as I said, he recognizes that these things work in different ways. He's not blind to that, but he does call them all names. That's something we're not going to do. We're going to reserve the term name specifically for expressions like these. David Boylan, J.K. Rowling, J.R.R. Tolkien, all expressions like these are what we're going to call names. And we're going to use different terms for these other kinds of words. So let's start with human. The word we're going to use for this is a kind term. And roughly speaking, the way to figure out whether something is a kind term is, can you combine it with words that we call quantifiers? So the quantifiers are a, or some, or two, three, most, all, and so on. We're going to talk more about quantifiers in the weeks to come. So take human. You can say a human, two humans, most humans, all humans. The fact that that is grammatical, that is meaningful, that tells you that human is a kind term. By that logic, other things are kind terms as well. For instance, like laptop, a laptop, two laptops, some laptops, and so on. So that's a test for whether something is a kind term. Gold, while it looks superficially similar, actually does work kind of differently. So we're going to call this an adjective. And the reason why we're distinguishing them is because if you think about it, gold actually doesn't pass the quantifier test that we just mentioned. Unlike with human, you can't talk about a gold or two golds or most golds. Like that doesn't really make sense. Gold isn't something that comes in kind of items like that. So that's why we want to distinguish these kinds of words. And finally, expressions like these, which we're going to pay a lot of attention to in a few weeks when we talk about Russell's undenoting, we're going to call these definite descriptions. So we call them descriptions because they talk about a person not directly but by virtue of some properties that they have. And we call them definite because they pick out a unique such thing. So the author of Harry Potter, that's exactly one person. So clearly these are all kind of similar in some way. Like this stands for a person, this stands for a particular kind, this stands for a property, the property of gold, and this stands for a person as well, although in a sort of more complicated way. And part of the question that Mill is wondering about is like, well, while superficially these all look kind of similar, they all stand for particular things in the world, are they really that unified after all? And what Mill wants to say in this chapter, effectively, is that there's a big difference between what we're calling names and everything else. But all of these kind of categories work differently from names. And in fact, he thinks there's more to the meanings of kind terms, adjectives, and definite descriptions than there is to just the meanings of names.